You already know more than you think. You just don't know how to read the signs yet. Every person you meet leaves clues. In the way they laugh too long at a joke that isn't funny, in the way they avoid your eyes when they say they're fine, and the way they change the subject the moment it gets too close to something real. These aren't accidents. They're confessions. And once you learn to see them, you can't unsee them. But here's what most people don't understand. Reading others isn't about becoming a mind reader. It's not about manipulation or control. It's about recognizing patterns. Patterns in behavior, patterns in speech, patterns in what people avoid and what they chase. Because everyone operates from a script, not one they consciously chose, but one that was written into them through pain, through childhood, through the moments they learned what kept them safe and what got them hurt. This book will teach you to read that script, not so you can use it against people, but so you can finally see what's really happening beneath the surface. So you can stop being confused by contradictions. Stop being fooled by performances. Stop taking personally what was never about you in the first place. And here's the truth that changes everything. When you learn to read others, you learn to read yourself. Because the masks you see on them are the same masks you wear. The fears you recognize in their behavior are the same fears running your own life. This isn't just about understanding people. It's about understanding the human condition, and that includes you. There was a philosopher who understood this better than most, Friedrich Nietzsche. He spent his life studying human nature, not from a distance, but from the inside out. He watched how people deceive themselves, how they build elaborate personas to hide from their own pain, how they project their shadows onto others rather than face what's broken inside. And he discovered something radical, that most people are not living their truth. They're performing a version of themselves they hope will be accepted. And that performance, that mask, is where all the clues are hidden. Nietzsche once said, "Every profound spirit needs a mask." He didn't mean that as an insult. He meant it as a warning not to confuse the mask with the person, because what you see on the surface is rarely the whole story. The kind person may not be kind at all. They may just be terrified of rejection. The confident person may be crumbling inside, hoping no one gets close enough to notice. The angry person may not be angry. They may be hurt beyond words, and anger is the only armor they know how to wear. This is what makes humans so complex, so fascinating, and so predictable once you know what to look for. Because while everyone's story is different, the patterns are universal. Fear drives behavior. Pain creates defense mechanisms. Childhood wounds show up in adult choices. And the things people criticize most loudly in others are often the things they hate most about themselves. When you understand these patterns, you stop being shocked by human behavior. You stop feeling betrayed when people act in ways that seem out of character, because you realize there is no out of character. There's only the mask and what's beneath it. But let me be clear about something. This book is not a manual for manipulation. It's not a guide to getting what you want by exploiting people's weaknesses. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the wrong place. This is about truth, about clarity, about compassion. Because when you truly see someone, when you understand the fear and pain driving their behavior, it becomes almost impossible to hate them. You might still set boundaries, you might still walk away, but you do it with understanding rather than judgment. And that changes everything. So what will you learn in this book? 18 psychological truths. 18 patterns that repeat in every human being you'll ever meet. These aren't theories. They're observations, tested across cultures, across time, across every relationship you've ever had, and they work, not because I made them up, but because human nature doesn't change. The masks get more sophisticated, the performances get more polished, but underneath we're all still running the same programs, still repeating the same defenses, still carrying the same wounds. This book is divided into 3 parts. In part 1, we explore the surface, the masks people wear and why they wear them. You'll learn to recognize when someone is performing versus when they're being real. You'll understand why people lie to themselves before they lie to you. And you'll see how projection works. How what someone criticizes in others is almost always what they're hiding in themselves. This section teaches you to stop taking everything at face value, to look deeper, to ask better questions. In part 2, we go beneath the surface, to the cracks in the mask, the moments when people slip, when their defenses fail and the truth leaks out. You'll learn to read fear, to spot insecurity disguised as confidence, to recognize when someone's life is a performance designed to hide emptiness. This is where you learn to see the truth, not in what people say, but in what they avoid, not in their words, but in their silences, not in their strengths, but in what threatens them. And in part 3, we reach the soul, the deepest layer, where childhood wounds become adult patterns, where envy disguises itself as criticism, where the need to be seen drives every decision. This section is about understanding not just what people do, but why they do it, where their pain comes from, what they're protecting, what they're still trying to prove. And this is where it gets personal, because every truth you recognize in others will reflect something back to you. Every pattern you spot will show you a pattern in yourself. And that's when reading people stops being a skill and starts being a mirror. Have you ever looked at someone and felt like you were only seeing the surface? Like there was a whole world underneath that you couldn't access? That's because there is. And by the end of this book, you'll have the tools to see it. Not to control it, but to understand it. And in understanding others, you'll finally understand yourself in ways you never expected. So let's begin. Because the moment you stop taking people at face value is the moment you start living in reality. And reality, as uncomfortable as it can be, is where real connection happens, where real growth happens, where you finally stop being confused by people and start seeing them for who they really are. Welcome to the truth behind the mask. Let's start reading. Part 1, The Surface, Chapter 1. Everyone wears a mask to survive. From the moment you're born, you're learning how to survive. Not just physically, emotionally, socially. You learn what gets you love and what gets you punished. What makes people smile and what makes them pull away. And without even realizing it, you start building a version of yourself designed to maximize acceptance and minimize pain. This isn't a conscious choice. It's survival, and everyone does it. Think about your own childhood for a moment. Were you allowed to be angry? Or did you learn that anger made people uncomfortable so you buried it and became the calm one. Were you praised for being helpful? So you became the person who always says yes, even when you're exhausted. Were you ignored when you were quiet? So you became loud, funny, the center of attention. Anything to be seen? These adaptations made sense at the time. They kept you safe. But here's the problem. Most people never grow out of them. They carry those childhood strategies into adulthood, still performing the role that once protected them, even when it no longer serves them. This is what the mask is really about. It's not that people are fake. It's that they're scared. Scared that if they drop the act, they'll be rejected. Scared that their real self isn't enough, so they keep performing. And over time, the mask becomes so familiar that they forget it's even there. They think this is who they are, but it's not. It's who they learned to be. And this is the first truth you need to understand if you want to read people. Everyone you meet is wearing a mask, not because they're dishonest, but because they're human. And the mask isn't the enemy. It's a survival tool. The problem is when you mistake the mask for the person, when you believe the performance and miss the truth underneath, because the truth is always there. You just have to know where to look. You look for tension, for the moments when the mask doesn't quite fit, for the flash of discomfort when someone's beliefs are challenged, for the way their voice changes when the conversation gets too personal, for the nervous laugh that doesn't match their words. These moments are cracks in the facade, and cracks are where the light gets in, where the real person shows through. Let me give you an example. You meet someone at a party. They're charming, confident, making everyone laugh, the life of the room. But watch closely. Notice how they interrupt when someone else starts getting attention. Notice how they steer every conversation back to themselves. Notice the slight edge in their voice when someone else gets praised. What you're seeing isn't confidence, it's performance. And underneath that performance is someone who's terrified of being invisible. Someone who learned early on that being entertaining was the only way to matter. Now here's the key. Once you see this, you don't judge them. You understand them, because you realize their behavior isn't about arrogance. It's about fear. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of being ordinary. Fear that if they stop performing, no one will care. And when you see that, everything shifts. You stop being annoyed by their need for attention. You start seeing the scared child underneath, and that's compassion. Not pity, compassion. But let's bring this back to you, because you have a mask too. Everyone does. Ask yourself, what role did you learn to play? Are you the strong one who never asks for help? The nice one who never says no? The logical one who never shows emotion? The independent one who never needs anyone? These aren't personality traits. They're survival strategies, and they're costing you, because the more you perform, the less you connect. The more you hide, the lonelier you become. And the irony is, you're doing it to be accepted. But what's being accepted isn't you. It's the mask. So how do you spot a mask? Look for consistency first. When someone is being real, there's a natural flow to their behavior. Their words match their energy. Their tone matches their message. But when someone is performing, there are contradictions. They say they're fine, but their body is tense. They laugh, but their eyes don't. They talk about how happy they are, but there's an edge of desperation underneath. These contradictions are tells. They're the mask slipping. Another sign, excessive anything, excessive kindness, excessive confidence, excessive humility. When something feels exaggerated, it usually is, because real traits don't need to be performed. They just are. But masks need constant reinforcement. So if someone is always talking about how honest they are, question it. If someone constantly reminds you how humble they are, doubt it. If someone's energy feels like a performance, trust that instinct. Because it probably is. And here's something most people miss. The mask isn't just about hiding weaknesses. Sometimes it's about hiding strength. Think about the person who plays small, who downplays their intelligence, who pretends not to care. That's a mask too. A mask designed to avoid triggering envy, to avoid standing out, to stay safe by staying invisible. So don't assume the mask is always about appearing better. Sometimes it's about appearing less. Because for some people, being seen is more dangerous than being ignored. Now let's talk about what to do with this information. Once you see someone's mask, you have a choice. You can call it out, which rarely goes well, because no one likes being told they're not who they think they are. Or you can work with it. You can speak to the person underneath. You can create space for them to drop the performance. You can show them through your own authenticity that it's safe to be real. And that's where real connection happens. Not when two masks talk to each other, but when two people are brave enough to take them off. But here's the hardest part. Taking off your own mask. Because as much as you want others to be real with you, you're probably still performing too. Still saying I'm fine when you're not. Still pretending you have it all together. Still hiding the parts of yourself you think are unacceptable. And as long as you're doing that, you'll attract people who do the same, because masks recognize masks, and real recognizes real. So the first step in reading people isn't to analyze them. It's to be honest with yourself, to ask, what am I hiding? What am I afraid people will see? What part of me am I protecting? Because when you stop performing, you stop tolerating performances. When you drop your mask, you can finally see when others are wearing theirs. And that clarity changes everything. It changes who you let into your life. It changes how you communicate. It changes what you're willing to accept. Because you're no longer operating from fear. You're operating from truth. Remember, everyone wears a mask to survive. But survival isn't the same as living. And the moment you realize that the moment you choose authenticity over acceptance is the moment you start attracting real connection. Not perfect connection, but real. And real is always better than perfect. Always. So as you move through this book, as you learn to read the masks others wear, don't forget to look in the mirror. Because the clearest mask you'll ever see is your own. And understanding it is the key to understanding everyone else. Chapter 2. What someone hates in others reveals what they're hiding in themselves. This is one of the most powerful psychological truths you'll ever learn. And once you see it, you'll see it everywhere. People don't just criticize randomly. They criticize strategically. And the target of their criticism tells you everything about what they're hiding from themselves. This is called projection. And it's one of the most reliable ways to read someone's inner world without them ever telling you directly. Here's how it works. When someone constantly mocks arrogance, they're usually struggling with their own sense of self-worth. When someone can't stop pointing out dishonesty in others, they're often hiding a truth they haven't faced in themselves. When someone obsessively criticizes people for being weak, it's because they're terrified of their own vulnerability. We hate in others what we're afraid to admit in ourselves. And the louder the criticism, the deeper the wound. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how the person who's always calling others fake is often the most performative? Or how the person who judges others for being emotional is usually the most emotionally repressed? Or how the person who accuses everyone of being selfish is often incapable of setting boundaries? This isn't coincidence. It's projection. And it's happening all around you, all the time. Most people just don't know how to spot it. The human capacity for self-deception is remarkable. We'd rather point fingers at others than look in the mirror, because looking in the mirror is painful. It means admitting that we're not who we think we are, that we have the same flaws we condemn in others, that we're hypocrites, and no one wants to be a hypocrite. So instead of facing that discomfort, we project. We take the parts of ourselves we hate and throw them onto other people. And then we attack them for it. It's a defense mechanism, and it works, until someone learns to see through it. So how do you spot projection? Listen to what someone criticizes repeatedly. Not once. Everyone has opinions, but if someone keeps coming back to the same criticism, if they seem almost obsessed with a particular flaw in others, that's a clue. That's not just an observation. That's a confession. They're telling you what they struggle with internally by pointing it out externally. And the more emotional they get about it, the more personal it is. Let me give you a real example. Imagine someone who constantly criticizes people for seeking attention. Every time someone posts on social media, they roll their eyes. Every time someone shares good news, they make a sarcastic comment. Every time someone enjoys being in the spotlight, they call them narcissistic. What does that tell you? It tells you that this person desperately wants attention, but doesn't feel worthy of it. So instead of admitting that need, they shame others for having it. They make needing attention a moral failing. Because if they can convince themselves it's bad, they don't have to face how much they want it themselves. Or think about the person who's always judging others for being lazy. They work constantly. They never rest. They criticize anyone who takes a break as weak or unmotivated. What are they really saying? They're saying, I'm terrified of being seen as lazy. I'm terrified that if I stop, I'll be worthless. So I have to keep working, and I have to judge others who don't, because their rest threatens my entire identity. This isn't about laziness. It's about fear that their value is tied to their productivity, and that fear gets projected onto everyone around them. Here's another one. The person who's constantly calling others selfish. They give endlessly. They sacrifice constantly. They never say no. And they resent anyone who sets boundaries. Why? Because deep down they want to be selfish. They want to prioritize themselves, but they've been taught that's wrong. So instead of honoring their own needs, they shame others for honoring theirs. They make selfishness the enemy, because if they admitted they want it, they'd have to face the guilt they've been carrying for years. Now here's where it gets interesting. Projection isn't always negative. Sometimes people project positive traits too. The person who constantly praises others for being brave might be desperate to find that courage in themselves. The person who admires intelligence in everyone might be insecure about their own. The person who sees beauty everywhere might be struggling to see it in themselves. So when you're reading someone, don't just look at what they criticize. Look at what they idolize, because that's projection too. It's just pointing in a different direction. But here's the question. How do you use this information without being manipulative? Because knowing someone's projections gives you power. You could exploit it. You could use it to hurt them. You could throw it back in their face during an argument. But that's not the point. The point is understanding. When you realize that someone's criticism of you is actually about them, you stop taking it personally. When you see that their judgment is a mirror reflecting their own pain, you stop feeling attacked. You start feeling compassion. Let me tell you what this looks like in practice. Someone criticizes you for being too emotional. In the past, you might have felt ashamed. You might have tried to prove you're not. You might have defended yourself. But now, with this understanding, you pause. You think, why does my emotion threaten them? And you realize they're not allowed to feel. So when they see you expressing freely, it reminds them of what they've repressed. And that's uncomfortable. So they attack, but it's not about you. It never was. Or someone accuses you of being selfish because you set a boundary. You might have felt guilty, might have apologized, might have given in, but now you understand. Their accusation isn't about your behavior. It's about their inability to set boundaries themselves. They're trapped in people-pleasing, and your freedom threatens their prison, so they call you selfish. But really, they're saying, I wish I could do what you're doing. And when you see that, you don't need to defend. You just hold your boundary with compassion. This is the power of understanding projection. It makes you immune to criticism that isn't true, not because you're arrogant, but because you can see where it's really coming from. And when you know it's not about you, it loses its sting. You stop absorbing other people's pain. You stop carrying their projections. You let them own their own shadows. And that's freedom. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You project too. Everyone does. So as you're learning to spot projection in others, turn that lens on yourself. What do you criticize most in other people? Be honest. Is it their neediness, their arrogance, their weakness, their coldness? Whatever it is, that's your shadow. That's the part of you that you haven't accepted yet. And until you do, you'll keep seeing it everywhere. You'll keep being triggered by it. You'll keep projecting it onto others instead of owning it in yourself. So ask yourself right now, what quality in others bothers me most? And then ask the harder question, where do I have that quality in myself? Because I promise you, if something bothers you that much, it's because you're seeing a reflection. And once you can admit that, once you can own your shadow, something miraculous happens. You stop judging others. You stop being triggered. You stop projecting. Because you're no longer at war with yourself. And when you're at peace with yourself, you can finally see others clearly, not through the filter of your own unresolved pain, but as they actually are. This understanding transforms how you move through the world, because we're all mirrors, reflecting each other's light and each other's darkness. And the moment you realize that, the moment you see that every criticism is a confession, is the moment you stop being hurt by people's opinions, because you understand They were never really talking about you. They were always talking about themselves. Always. Chapter 3. Silence reveals more than words. Most people think communication is about talking, about explaining, about making yourself understood through words. But there's a deeper truth that changes everything. Silence is often the loudest form of communication. What someone doesn't say tells you more than what they do. The pauses, the hesitations, the topics they avoid, these are where the truth lives, because words can lie, but silence rarely does. Think about the last time you asked someone a deep question. How are you really doing? What do you really want? Are you happy? Notice what happened. Did they answer immediately? Or did they pause? Did they give you a quick, rehearsed response? Or did they take time to consider? That pause tells you everything, because an instant answer is usually a defense, a prepared script, something they've told themselves so many times they don't even question it anymore. But a long pause? That's honesty struggling to surface. That's the real answer fighting past the armor. Silence reveals discomfort, and discomfort reveals truth. When someone changes the subject quickly, they're telling you that topic is dangerous. When someone gives short answers to deep questions, they're telling you they don't feel safe going there. When someone avoids eye contact while saying they're fine, their body is telling you what their words won't. And this is the key. People leak truth through silence because silence is harder to control than speech. You can rehearse what you'll say, but you can't rehearse what you won't say. And that's where you find the real person. Let me show you how this works in practice. You're talking to someone who seems confident. They talk a lot. They fill every silence. They dominate the conversation. But notice something. They never pause. They never leave space for reflection. They never let the conversation go deep. Why? Because silence makes them uncomfortable. Because in silence they might have to feel something they've been avoiding. So they talk and talk and talk. And the more they talk, the more they're telling you they're scared of what will surface if they stop. Now contrast that with someone who's comfortable with silence. Someone who can sit with a pause. Who doesn't need to fill every gap. Who can let a question hang in the air. That person is comfortable with themselves. They're not running from their inner world. They're not afraid of what might come up. And that comfort with silence is a sign of emotional maturity. Because it takes strength to sit with discomfort, to let things be unresolved, to exist without constant distraction. But here's where most people misread silence. They think silence means agreement, or that it means someone has nothing to say. But often, silence means the opposite. It means there's too much to say, too much pain, too much complexity, too much risk. So instead of saying the wrong thing, they say nothing. And that nothing is a scream if you know how to hear it. I'll give you an example. You confront someone about something they did that hurt you. You're honest, vulnerable, clear, and they say nothing. They just sit there. Most people interpret this as indifference, as not caring. But look closer. Are they really indifferent? Or are they frozen? Is their jaw tight? Are their hands clenched? Are their eyes avoiding yours? Because that's not indifference. That's overwhelm. That's someone who's feeling too much and doesn't know how to express it. And their silence isn't rejection. It's protection. Protection from saying something they'll regret, or protection from breaking down. or protection from facing a truth they're not ready to admit. So when you're reading someone, don't just listen to their words. Listen to their silences. Notice what topics they avoid. Notice what questions make them change the subject. Notice where the conversation flows easily and where it hits a wall, because those walls are boundaries around pain, and pain is where the truth lives. Not always, but often enough that it's worth paying attention. Now let's talk about what you do with this information. When you notice someone's silence, you have two options. You can push, you can demand they talk. You can try to force them into vulnerability, but that rarely works, because people don't open up when they feel pressured. They shut down. Or you can honor the silence. You can sit with it. You can show them through your own stillness that it's okay not to have all the answers. And that patience, that respect for their process, that's what creates safety. And safety is what allows people to eventually share what they've been holding. But here's something most people don't realize. Silence isn't just about others. It's about you, too. Because if you're uncomfortable with silence, if you feel the need to fill every gap, if you can't sit with uncertainty, that tells you something about yourself. It tells you that you're avoiding something. Maybe you're avoiding your own feelings. Maybe you're avoiding intimacy. Maybe you're avoiding the discomfort of not being in control. Whatever it is, your need to fill silence is a sign that something inside you is unresolved. So practice sitting with silence, not in a manipulative way, but in an honest way. When someone asks you a question, pause before answering. Let yourself feel before you speak. Notice what comes up. Notice if your first instinct is to give the safe answer, the answer that makes you look good, the answer that avoids conflict. And then ask yourself, what's the true answer? The one I'm afraid to say? Because often the truest answer is the one that takes the longest to arrive. And learning to wait for it is how you stop performing and start being real. Here's another way silence reveals truth. Watch what someone does when there's nothing to do, when the distraction stops, when they're alone with their thoughts. Do they immediately reach for their phone, turn on the TV, call someone? That's avoidance. That's someone who can't be alone with themselves. And if they can't be alone with themselves, they probably don't know themselves, which means the person you're interacting with is a performance, not necessarily a dishonest one, but a performance nonetheless. But the person who can sit in silence, the person who doesn't need constant stimulation, the person who can be alone without feeling lonely, that person knows themselves. And knowing yourself is the foundation of authenticity, because you can't be real with others if you're not real with yourself. And you can't be real with yourself if you're constantly running from your own thoughts. So if you want to read someone, create silence. Don't fill every gap. Don't rush to make them comfortable. Let the discomfort sit, and watch what they do with it. Do they squirm? Do they deflect? Do they run? Or do they settle into it? Do they meet your eyes? Do they breathe? Because how someone handles silence tells you how they handle themselves. And how they handle themselves tells you everything. But remember, silence is not the absence of communication. It's a different form of communication. It's the body speaking when the mouth won't. It's the soul expressing what words can't capture. It's the truth leaking out in the spaces between sentences. And if you can learn to listen to silence the way you listen to words, you'll hear what people are really saying. Not the story they've rehearsed, but the story they're living. And that's where real understanding begins. In the quiet, in the pause, in the space where truth has room to breathe. Chapter 4. Excessive virtue is often disguised vanity. Be very careful of the person who's always right, the one who never misses a chance to correct others, who loudly proclaims their moral superiority, who broadcasts their virtues like a billboard. There's a term for this, the will to power in disguise. And what it means is this: sometimes morality isn't about goodness. It's about control. It's about feeling superior. It's about using righteousness as a weapon. And when you see someone performing virtue excessively, you're not seeing purity. You're seeing vanity dressed up as ethics. Think about it. Real goodness doesn't need an audience. It doesn't require applause. It doesn't demand recognition. It just is. The person who volunteers and never mentions it. That's real. The person who helps and doesn't post about it. That's real. The person who does the right thing, even when no one's watching. That's real. But the person who makes sure everyone knows how good they are, that's performance. And performance always serves the ego. Always. Here's how you spot it. Excessive virtue signaling. When someone's entire identity is built on being moral, being conscious, being woke, being spiritual, whatever the language of their tribe is. When they never miss an opportunity to point out how evolved they are compared to everyone else. When they're more concerned with appearing good than with actually being good. That's disguised vanity. And it's everywhere, in politics, in spirituality, in activism, in any space where moral high ground can be claimed and weaponized. Let me give you an example. You're in a conversation. Someone shares a struggle. Before they even finish, another person jumps in with advice. Not to help, but to show how wise they are. They don't ask questions. They don't listen deeply. They just perform wisdom. And you can feel it. It doesn't land as support. It lands as superiority. Because that's what it is. It's not about the person struggling. It's about the person advising. It's about them proving they have the answers. And that need to prove. That's ego, disguised as helpfulness. Or think about the person who's constantly calling out others for not being ethical enough, not woke enough, not conscious enough. They police language. They police behavior. They make everything a moral test. And if you fail, they let you know, publicly, with righteous anger. But here's the question. Are they really trying to make the world better? Or are they trying to feel better than others? Because there's a difference. Real ethics come from compassion. Fake ethics come from judgment. And judgment is always about ego. The truth is that people often use morality as a mask for their own insecurity. The loudest moralists are often the most fragile. Because if your entire identity is built on being good, you can't afford to be wrong. You can't afford to be questioned. You can't afford to admit you're still learning. So you double down, you get defensive. You attack anyone who challenges your righteousness. And that defensiveness is the giveaway. Because secure people don't need to defend their goodness. It's just who they are. So how do you tell the difference between real virtue and performed virtue? Look at the response to being challenged. When someone with real integrity is questioned, they pause, they consider, they're open to being wrong. because their goodness isn't about ego, it's about truth. But when someone with performed virtue is questioned, they attack, they deflect, they make you the problem, because their virtue isn't about truth, it's about image, and anything that threatens the image must be destroyed. Here's another test. Does their virtue cost them anything? Real goodness often requires sacrifice, uncomfortable sacrifice. It means speaking up when it's not popular, standing alone when everyone else stays silent, giving when it hurts. But performed virtue, it's convenient, it costs nothing. It's tweeting support, sharing posts, wearing the right symbols, saying the right words, all while their actual life remains unchanged, all while their behavior contradicts their proclamations. And that gap between what they preach and what they practice, that's where the vanity lives. Let me tell you why this matters. Because if you can't spot performed virtue, you'll trust the wrong people. You'll be manipulated by appearances. You'll mistake loudness for truth, and you'll end up giving power to people who don't deserve it. People who use morality as a tool for control rather than connection. People who are more interested in being seen as good than in actually doing good. And those people are dangerous, not because they're evil, but because they're convinced they're not. And that conviction makes them blind to their own harm. But here's the uncomfortable part. You do this too. Everyone does. Think about the last time you did something good. Did you tell someone? Did you post about it? Did you make sure people knew? If so, why? Was it to inspire others? Or was it to be seen as inspiring? There's a difference, and only you know which one it was. But be honest with yourself, because the moment you start performing goodness for validation is the moment it stops being good. It becomes ego maintenance. And ego maintenance is always about fear. Fear that without the performance you're not enough. So here's the practice. When you feel the urge to broadcast your virtue, pause. Ask yourself, why do I need people to know this? What am I trying to prove? Am I doing this for the act itself, or for the recognition? And if the honest answer is recognition, don't judge yourself. Just notice it, because noticing is the first step to changing. And changing is how you stop performing and start being real. Now let's talk about what to do when you encounter performed virtue in others. First, don't call it out publicly. That never goes well, because performed virtue is fragile, and fragile things break loudly. If you challenge someone's moral identity publicly, they'll defend it viciously, because you're not just challenging their behavior, you're challenging their entire sense of self. So don't. Instead, create space for them to drop the performance privately. Ask them questions, real questions, not to trap them, but to invite deeper thought. For example, if someone's always preaching about something, ask them, how do you live that principle in your day-to-day life? Not accusatorily, genuinely. And watch what happens. If they're real, they'll share struggles, moments they failed, ways they're still learning. But if it's performance, they'll deflect. They'll give abstract answers. They'll avoid specifics. Because the performance can't handle specifics. Specifics reveal the gap between image and reality. And that gap is terrifying for someone whose identity depends on the image. But here's the deeper truth. Excessive virtue is often a response to shame. Deep, unresolved shame. The person who needs to be seen as perfectly moral often believes they're deeply flawed, so they overcompensate. They build an identity of goodness to counteract the shame, and the louder the proclamation, the deeper the shame. This isn't judgment. It's understanding, because when you see performed virtue as a defense mechanism rather than a character flaw, you stop being angry at it. You start seeing the pain underneath, and pain deserves compassion, not agreement, but compassion. So as you move through the world, watch for excessive virtue, not to judge it, but to understand it, to see it for what it is, a mask, a performance, a way of avoiding the discomfort of being imperfect. And when you see it, remember this: real goodness is quiet. Real integrity doesn't shout. Real virtue doesn't need an audience. It just does what's right and moves on. And that quietness, that humility, that's what you should trust. Not the loudest voice, not the most righteous performance, but the person who does good when no one's watching. That's where real character lives, in the silence of unwitnessed acts, in the consistency of private choices, in the gap between who they are when seen and who they are when invisible. And when there's no gap, that's when you've found someone real. Hold on to them, because they're rare. Chapter 5. People don't lie to you first. They lie to themselves. This is the truth that changes everything. The lies you hear from people aren't calculated deceptions. They're not deliberate attempts to hurt you or manipulate you. There's something far more unconscious. They're lies people have been telling themselves for so long that they've become their reality. And understanding this, really understanding it, is the key to reading people at the deepest level. Because once you realize that self-deception comes first, you stop taking people's lies personally. You start seeing them as symptoms of something deeper. Let me explain. When someone says I'm fine, and they're clearly not, they're not lying to you. They're lying to themselves first. They've told themselves they're fine so many times that they believe it, even though their body is tense, even though their voice is shaking, even though every signal says otherwise. The lie has become their truth, and they're just repeating it to you because that's the story they're living. Or think about the person who says, I don't care what anyone thinks, but then they check their phone obsessively, change their plans based on who might be there, spend hours crafting the perfect image. They're not lying to you intentionally. They've convinced themselves they don't care, because caring would mean admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like weakness. So they bury it, they deny it, and they present the version of themselves they wish was true. And over time, the line between the wish and reality blurs, and they genuinely believe their own story, even when it contradicts everything they do. The human ability to rewrite our own narratives is incredible. We take painful truths and transform them into comfortable lies, not out of malice, but out of survival, because facing certain truths is unbearable. So we don't. We create alternative versions. We tell ourselves stories that let us sleep at night. And those stories become our identity, until someone or something forces us to question them. Here's an example. Someone tells you they're over their ex. They say it with confidence. They talk about moving on, but watch their behavior. Do they still bring up the ex in conversation? Do they still check their social media? Do they still avoid places they used to go together? That's not someone who's moved on. That's someone who's telling themselves they've moved on because the alternative is too painful. And when they say I'm over it, they're not lying to you. They're reinforcing the lie they need to believe. And you just happen to be there when they say it out loud. So what does this mean for reading people? It means you can't trust their words alone. You have to watch for the gap between what they say and what they do, between their proclaimed beliefs and their actual behavior, between their self-image and their actions. That gap is where the truth lives, not in what they claim to be, but in what they reveal through inconsistency. And those inconsistencies are everywhere once you start looking. Someone says they value honesty above all else, but they lie to avoid conflict. That's not hypocrisy in the intentional sense. That's self-deception. They believe they value honesty, but what they actually value more is comfort. They just haven't admitted that to themselves yet. So they keep saying honesty is everything while lying whenever the truth feels too hard. And they don't see the contradiction because they've convinced themselves that small lies don't count, or that they're protecting others, or whatever story lets them avoid facing the discomfort of their own dishonesty. Or think about the person who says they're independent. They don't need anyone. But their entire life revolves around seeking approval. They make decisions based on what will impress others, change their opinions to fit in, panic when they're alone. They're not lying to you when they say they're independent. They've internalized that as their identity, because admitting dependence feels like admitting weakness, and they can't afford that. So they lie to themselves, and that lie shapes everything they do, even as it contradicts their words constantly. Here's what makes self-deception so tricky. It's not static. It evolves. People add layers. They build entire belief systems around their lies, and those belief systems become their reality. So when you challenge them, you're not just challenging a lie. You're challenging their entire sense of self, which is why people get so defensive, why they attack when you point out contradictions, because you're threatening the foundation of their identity. And that feels like an existential threat, even when you're just stating facts. So how do you navigate this? How do you interact with someone who's living in a self-created illusion? First, understand that you can't force them to see it. People only wake up from self-deception when they're ready, when the pain of the lie becomes greater than the pain of the truth. Until then, no amount of logic, evidence, or confrontation will work. In fact, it'll make them double down, because the more threatened they feel, the harder they'll defend the lie. That's how ego works. It protects itself at all costs. But you can create conditions that make seeing the truth easier. You do that through non-judgment, through patience, through asking questions instead of making statements. When someone says something that contradicts their behavior, don't call them out. Ask them about it, gently, curiously. You said you don't care what people think, but I noticed you seemed really upset when they didn't respond. What was that about? No accusation, just observation, and space for them to reflect. Most people won't take that space. They'll deflect. But some will pause, and that pause is where cracks appear, where truth has a chance to slip through. Another approach? Reflect back what you see, not with judgment, but with clarity. I hear you saying you're fine, but your energy feels really heavy right now. Is there something else going on? Again, no attack, just mirroring, because sometimes people don't realize they're lying until someone holds up a mirror. And when that mirror is held with compassion, not accusation, they're more likely to actually look, instead of smashing it in self-defense. But here's the hard part. Sometimes you have to accept that someone's not ready, that they're going to keep lying to themselves, and maybe to you, and you have to decide if you can live with that. Can you be in relationship with someone who's not facing their truth? Can you love someone who's hiding from themselves? There's no right answer. It depends on the situation, the depth of the relationship, the level of harm being caused. But what you can't do is force them to change. That never works, and trying will only drain you. Now, let's bring this back to you, because you lie to yourself too. Everyone does. So ask yourself, what am I not facing? What truth have I been avoiding? What story have I been telling myself that doesn't match my behavior? This takes radical honesty, and most people don't have it. They'd rather stay comfortable. But if you want to read others clearly, you have to read yourself first. You have to face your own lies, because the lies you tell yourself are the same lies you'll miss in others. The blind spots you have internally will become blind spots externally. So do the work. Get honest. Face what you've been avoiding, and watch how much clearer everyone else becomes. That's what facing your own self-deception does. It frees you to be who you actually are instead of who you think you should be. And that freedom makes you real, not perfect, but real. And real is always more powerful than perfect, because real can't be shaken. Perfect can. So get real with yourself. Face the lies. Own the contradictions, and watch how much easier it becomes to see them in others. Not to judge them, but to understand them, because we're all just humans doing our best to survive our own pain. And sometimes lying to ourselves is the only way we know how, until we learn a better way, until we get brave enough to face the truth. And that bravery starts with you. Chapter 6. Where someone feels superior, they're hiding inferiority. There's a type of person you've probably met. The one who always needs to be right, always needs to win, always needs to remind you of their accomplishments, their intelligence, their status. They dominate conversations. They compete over things that don't matter. They can't let anyone else shine without diminishing it or redirecting attention back to themselves. And on the surface, this looks like confidence, like strength, like someone who knows their worth. But look closer. Real confidence doesn't compete. It doesn't need to, because it's already secure. So when you see someone constantly performing superiority, what you're really seeing is someone desperately trying to convince themselves they're enough. And the louder the performance, the deeper the doubt. This is one of the most reliable patterns in human psychology. Overcompensation. When someone feels inferior internally, they create an external display of superiority to hide it. Not from you, from themselves. Because if they can convince everyone else, maybe they can convince themselves too. Let me show you how this plays out. You're in a meeting. Someone shares an idea. Before they even finish, another person jumps in. Not to build on it, but to one-up it. To show they thought of something better. To make sure everyone knows they're the smartest in the room. What are they really saying? They're saying, I'm terrified you won't think I'm valuable. I'm terrified I'll be forgotten, so I need to dominate. I need to be the center, because if I'm not, maybe I don't matter. Or think about the person who's always name-dropping, always telling you about who they know, what they've done, where they've been. They weave their achievements into every conversation, and it feels exhausting. Why? Because it's not about connection. It's about proving. And what are they trying to prove? That they're somebody, that they matter, that they're worthy of respect. But here's the thing. People who truly believe they're somebody don't need to prove it. They just are. And everyone feels it without a word being said. This is about a fundamental human drive, a drive to feel significant, to overcome obstacles, to assert oneself. But when that drive is rooted in insecurity, it becomes toxic. It becomes domination instead of creation. It becomes needing to be better than others instead of being the best version of yourself. And that need to be better than is always compensating for feeling less than. So how do you spot this? Look for competition where there shouldn't be any. Look for someone who can't celebrate others' success without making it about themselves. Look for someone who feels threatened by others' accomplishments instead of inspired. That's insecurity. Pure insecurity, wearing the mask of superiority. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, because it's everywhere, in workplaces, in families, in friendships. Everywhere there's a scared person trying to prove they're not. Here's another sign: constant comparison. The person who always needs to point out how they're different, better, more evolved, more conscious, more successful. Whatever the metric, they're always winning it. And they make sure you know. But why? Because comparison is the language of insecurity. Secure people don't compare. They don't need to. They're too busy living their own lives to worry about how they stack up against others. But insecure people? They're obsessed with rank, with hierarchy, with making sure they're above someone, because being below is unbearable. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This pattern doesn't just show up in arrogance. It shows up in false humility too. Think about the person who's always talking about how humble they are, how they don't care about status, how they're just a simple person. But somehow every story they tell still centers on them, still highlights their sacrifice, still makes them the hero. That's not humility. That's superiority disguised as humility. It's saying I'm so evolved that I don't need to be superior, which is just another way of saying I'm superior. So what do you do with this information? First, stop being intimidated by people who perform superiority, because now you know what it really is. It's not strength. It's fear. And fear can't actually hurt you. It can only perform loudly. Second, don't engage with the competition. When someone tries to one-up you, don't take the bait. Don't try to prove yourself. Just let it sit. Let them have their moment. Because the moment you compete, you're playing their game. And their game is designed to keep them feeling superior. So don't play, just be. And watch how disorienting that is for them, because they don't know what to do with someone who isn't threatened. But here's the compassionate angle. Remember that this person is suffering. They're not doing this because they're a bad person. They're doing it because they're in pain. Because somewhere, probably in childhood, they learned that their worth was conditional. That they had to be the best to be loved. and that wound has never healed. So now they're stuck in a loop of proving, and it's exhausting for them and everyone around them. So instead of judging them, see them. See the scared child underneath the arrogant adult, and hold space for that, not by letting them dominate you, but by refusing to feed their narrative. Now turn this inward. Where do you feel superior? Because you do. Everyone does. Maybe it's your intelligence, your morality, your work ethic, your emotional awareness. Whatever it is, there's a place where you feel better than others. And that place is worth examining, because superiority is always compensation. Always. So ask yourself, where do I feel inferior that I'm trying to hide? What am I proving? Who am I trying to convince? And be honest. Because the more honest you are with yourself, the less you'll need to perform for others. Real confidence is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't compare. It doesn't compete unless there's joy in the challenge itself. Real confidence is being okay with someone else being better than you at something, because your worth isn't tied to being the best. It's just inherent. You exist. That's enough. And when you truly believe that, you stop needing to prove anything. You stop needing to be superior. You just are who you are, and that's infinitely more powerful than any performance could ever be. So the next time you encounter someone who needs to be superior, remember this. They're not your enemy. They're just scared, and scared people lash out. They dominate. They compete. Not because they're strong, but because they're fragile. And when you see that fragility, instead of the performance, everything changes. You stop being reactive. You stop being hurt. You just see a human trying to survive the only way they know how. And that seeing is the beginning of real compassion. Not pity, not agreement, but compassion. The kind that says, I see you. I see what you're protecting, and I won't attack it. But I also won't feed it. I'll just be here. Real, unafraid. And maybe, just maybe, that will show you there's another way to be. A way that doesn't require performing. A way that doesn't require proving. A way that's just being. And being is always enough. Part 2. The Cracks, Chapter 7. Most actions are driven by unconscious fear. Let's start with a question that changes everything. Why do people do what they do? Most would say desire, ambition, goals, values, but there's a deeper truth beneath the surface. Beneath almost every action is fear. Not always, but far more often than we'd like to admit. Fear of abandonment, fear of failure, fear of being exposed, fear of being ordinary, fear of not mattering. And when you start seeing behavior through this lens, everything makes sense. The contradictions, the self-sabotage, the patterns that seem irrational, they're all responses to fear that's running underneath. Think about the person who can't say no. Why can't they? Most would say they're too nice, too agreeable, too selfless. But look deeper. They're terrified. Terrified that if they say no, they'll be rejected, that they'll be seen as selfish, that people will stop liking them. So they say yes, again and again, even when it hurts, even when they're exhausted, even when they resent it, because the fear of rejection is stronger than the pain of overextending. That's not kindness, that's fear. Or take the person who dominates every conversation. Why do they do it? Surface level, you might think they're arrogant, self-absorbed, narcissistic, but underneath, they're terrified of being forgotten, terrified that if they're not the center of attention, they'll disappear, that they won't matter. So they talk constantly, loudly, not because they think they're better, but because they're terrified they're not enough. And if they stop talking, that fear might be confirmed. This is the insight that changes how you see people. When you realize that most behavior is fear-driven, you stop taking things personally. You stop being offended by someone's rudeness. You recognize it as defensiveness. You stop being hurt by someone's coldness. You recognize it as self-protection. You stop being confused by someone's inconsistency. You recognize it as internal conflict between what they want and what they're afraid of. And that recognition is power, because you're no longer reacting to the surface. You're responding to the root. Let me give you a framework. When someone does something that bothers you, ask this question: what are they afraid of? Not what do they want. What are they afraid of losing? Because fear of loss is a stronger motivator than desire for gain. Always. Someone who lies constantly, they're afraid of being judged. Someone who controls everything, they're afraid of chaos. Someone who seeks attention endlessly, they're afraid of being invisible. Once you identify the fear, the behavior makes perfect sense, and you stop judging. You start understanding. But here's where it gets tricky. People don't consciously know they're driven by fear. They rationalize. They tell themselves stories. They say, I'm just particular about how things are done, or I'm just being honest, or I'm just advocating for myself. And they believe these stories because the alternative, admitting they're afraid, feels weak, vulnerable, unacceptable. So they hide it, even from themselves. And that's what makes reading people so challenging. You're not looking for what they're telling you. You're looking for what they're hiding from themselves. So how do you identify someone's core fear? Watch what threatens them. Watch what makes them defensive. Watch what they avoid. Because avoidance is always a sign. If someone avoids conflict, they're afraid of confrontation. If someone avoids commitment, they're afraid of being trapped. If someone avoids vulnerability, they're afraid of being hurt. And these avoidances shape their entire life, their relationships, their career, their choices, all organized around not triggering the fear, which means their life isn't about moving toward what they want. It's about moving away from what they're afraid of. And that's a prison. Here's an example. Someone says they want a relationship, but they sabotage every time it gets close. Why? Because deep down they're more afraid of being hurt than they are excited about love. So they create distance. They pick fights. They find flaws, not consciously, but as a defense. Because if they push the person away first, they don't have to risk being abandoned. The fear is driving the behavior, and the behavior contradicts the stated desire. But when you understand the fear, it all makes sense. Or think about the person who works constantly, who never rests, who defines themselves by productivity. They say it's about ambition, about building something, about success. But what if it's actually about fear? Fear that if they stop, they'll have to feel something they've been avoiding. Fear that their worth is tied to their output. Fear that rest means worthlessness. So they work endlessly, and they call it drive, but really it's avoidance of discomfort, of emptiness, of the question, who am I when I'm not producing? Now here's the uncomfortable truth. You're driven by fear too. Everyone is. So ask yourself, what am I afraid of? What do I avoid? What makes me defensive? And be honest, because the fears you refuse to acknowledge are the ones controlling you. And as long as they're unconscious, they'll dictate your behavior without you even realizing it. But when you name them, when you face them, they lose power. Not all of it, but enough. Enough that you can start choosing differently. Start acting from desire instead of fear. And that shift is everything. So as you read people, remember this. Almost everyone is afraid of something. And that fear is leaking out in everything they do. The way they love, the way they work, the way they communicate, the way they defend. It's all connected to fear. And when you see it, when you really see it, you stop being reactive. You stop being hurt because you understand they're not trying to harm you. They're just trying to protect themselves. And sometimes protection looks like attack, but it's not. It's just fear wearing the wrong mask. And recognizing that is the beginning of real compassion. Not tolerance, not agreement, but compassion. The kind that says, I see your fear. I'm not going to trigger it, but I'm also not going to let it control me. I'm just going to be here. Clear, boundaried, and unafraid. And maybe that will create enough safety for you to drop the defense. And if not, that's okay too. Because my peace doesn't depend on your fear being resolved. It depends on me seeing it for what it is. And not taking it personally. That's freedom. That's power. That's what reading people at this level gives you. Clarity, compassion, and the ability to stay grounded no matter what fear you're encountering. That's the gift of seeing beneath the surface. Chapter 8. Criticism is a mirror. When someone criticizes too much, listen closely. Not to what they're saying, but to what they're revealing about themselves. Because excessive criticism is rarely about the target. It's about the critic. The man who mocks emotional people might be terrified of his own feelings. The woman who belittles others for their appearance might be locked in a secret war with her reflection. Judgment is almost never about the other. It's about the self. This is one of the most consistent patterns in human behavior. When someone's criticism becomes habitual, when they can't seem to stop pointing out flaws in others, they're projecting. They're taking something they can't accept in themselves and attacking it externally, because it's easier to destroy it out there than to face it in here. And once you understand this, criticism loses its power over you, because you realize it was never really about you at all. Think about it. The person who constantly accuses others of being attention-seeking is usually desperate for attention themselves. But they've convinced themselves that wanting attention is bad, so they can't own that need. They have to condemn it in others. The person who always points out when someone's being fake or inauthentic, they're usually the ones struggling most with their own authenticity. They see their own mask reflected in everyone else, and it makes them uncomfortable, so they attack. But here's what makes this so powerful. Once you recognize that criticism is projection, you can use it as a map to someone's inner world, their insecurities, their struggles, their unresolved pain, because what they criticize most loudly is what they're fighting most privately. And when you see that, you stop being defensive. You stop needing to prove them wrong. You just see a person in pain, attacking their own reflection. Let me give you a specific example. You're talking to someone and they make a comment about how you're always so worried about what others think. They say it with judgment, with superiority, like they're above caring about others' opinions. But watch their behavior. Do they constantly check how they're being perceived? Do they get defensive when questioned? Do they need everyone to agree with them? That's not someone who doesn't care. That's someone who cares deeply but has made caring wrong, so they project it onto you. They criticize you for what they can't accept in themselves. Or think about the person who's always commenting on how lazy others are. They mock people who take breaks. They judge anyone who isn't constantly productive. They make rest seem like a moral failing. What does that tell you? It tells you they're exhausted, that they're running themselves into the ground, that they desperately need to rest but don't feel they're allowed to, so they make it wrong for everyone else. Because if it's wrong for others, they don't have to face how much they need it themselves. This is why understanding projection is so liberating. Because once you see it, you stop absorbing other people's criticism as truth. You recognize it as their issue, not yours. You can hear someone say you're too sensitive without believing it, because you understand they're probably disconnected from their own sensitivity. You can hear someone say you're selfish without guilt, because you know they're probably struggling to honor their own needs. The criticism stops landing, because you see where it's really coming from. But here's where it gets more nuanced. Projection isn't always about negative traits. Sometimes people project their disowned strengths too. The person who constantly praises others for being confident might be hiding their own confidence. The person who's always admiring someone else's courage might be too afraid to access their own. They see in others what they can't see in themselves, and they elevate it externally rather than claiming it internally. So when you're reading someone, pay attention to both their criticisms and their praise. What do they attack? What do they admire? Because both are showing you their shadow, the parts of themselves they've split off, the qualities they can't integrate. And when you see this pattern, you have a choice. You can use it against them, point out their hypocrisy, make them defensive, or you can use it with compassion, understanding that they're not trying to hurt you. They're just trying to manage their own pain. Here's how this plays out in practice. Someone criticizes you harshly. Your first instinct might be to defend, to explain, to prove they're wrong. But what if you paused instead? What if you asked yourself, what does this criticism reveal about them? Maybe they're criticizing your vulnerability because they're terrified of their own. Maybe they're attacking your success because they feel like a failure. Maybe they're judging your choices because they're unhappy with theirs. And suddenly, the criticism isn't about you anymore. It's information about their inner world. And when you understand that, you can respond differently. You don't need to fight. You don't need to prove. You can just hold your ground. You can say thank you for sharing your perspective and move on. Because you know their criticism says more about them than it does about you. And that knowledge is freedom. But let's bring this back to you. Because you criticize too. Everyone does. So ask yourself, what do I criticize most in others? What really bothers me? What do I judge? And then ask the harder question. Where does that quality exist in me? Because I promise you, if it bothers you that much, it's because you're seeing yourself. Maybe it's a part you've rejected. Maybe it's a part you're ashamed of. Maybe it's a part you don't want to admit exists. But it's there. And until you own it, you'll keep seeing it everywhere. You'll keep being triggered. You'll keep projecting. So do the work. Face your shadow. Own the parts of yourself you've been criticizing in others. Because when you do, something amazing happens. You stop being bothered by those qualities in other people. You stop needing to judge. You stop needing to attack. Because there's nothing left to defend against. You've integrated it. It's just part of being human. And that acceptance changes everything. It makes you free. Free from the exhausting cycle of projection. Free to see people as they are, not as reflections of your unresolved pain. And that freedom is worth every uncomfortable moment it takes to get there. Chapter 9. Guilt hides behind false confidence. There's a kind of person you've probably met. The one who seems overly sure of themselves, always in control, always composed, never uncertain. They project an image of absolute confidence, of having it all figured out. But watch long enough and you'll see something else. The tension in their jaw, the way they over-prepare, the defensiveness under pressure. Because what looks like confidence is often something else entirely. It's guilt hiding behind a carefully constructed facade. Guilt is one of the most powerful emotional drivers in human behavior. And when it goes unresolved, it creates a strange kind of overcompensation. People who carry deep guilt often perform extreme confidence, not because they're actually secure, but because they're trying to convince themselves and everyone else that they're okay, that they're good, that they're worthy, when deep down they believe they're not. Think about it. Have you ever met someone who's overly defensive about their choices? Who needs to justify every decision? Who can't handle even gentle questioning without getting triggered? That's not confidence. That's guilt. They're defending against their own doubt, their own shame, their own sense that maybe they're not making the right choices, but admitting that would be too painful. So they double down, they perform certainty, and that performance becomes their identity. Or consider the person who's always explaining why they're right, who can't just be wrong about something small without it becoming a referendum on their character, who treats every disagreement like a personal attack. What are they really protecting? They're protecting against the guilt they carry. Guilt about past mistakes. Guilt about not being good enough. Guilt about letting people down. And if they can just be right about everything now, maybe they can balance out all the times they were wrong before. This is why false confidence is so exhausting to be around. Because it's not confidence at all. It's constant vigilance, constant defense, constant performance. Real confidence is relaxed. It can be wrong. It cannot know. It can admit fault without falling apart. What false confidence? It's rigid. It's brittle, and it breaks under pressure, because it was never real to begin with. So how do you spot false confidence? Look for overcompensation. When someone's sureness feels aggressive rather than calm, when their certainty feels defensive rather than grounded, when they need to prove their worth rather than simply embodying it, that's false confidence. And underneath it is always guilt, always shame, always a sense of not being enough. Here's another tell. Watch how someone reacts to criticism. Real confidence can hear feedback without collapsing. It can consider different perspectives. It can be challenged without being threatened. But false confidence can't. Any criticism feels like an attack. Any questioning feels like an assault on their character. Why? Because they're already questioning themselves. They're already criticizing themselves. So when you do it externally, it confirms what they fear most, that they're not who they're pretending to be. Let me give you a personal example. Years ago, I knew someone who projected absolute certainty about their life choices. They'd left a stable career to pursue something risky, and every time anyone expressed concern, they'd launch into a passionate defense of why it was the right decision, how they'd never been happier, how it was all working out perfectly. But their behavior told a different story. They were stressed, overworked, struggling financially, but they couldn't admit it. Because admitting it would mean facing the guilt of making a mistake, of letting people down, of not having it all figured out. So they performed confidence, right up until they broke down. This is the danger of false confidence. It doesn't just fool others. It fools the person performing it. They start to believe their own performance, until reality forces them to confront it. And then the crash is hard, because they've been running from their guilt instead of facing it. And guilt doesn't go away just because you pretend it's not there. It builds, it compounds, it waits until you're finally ready to look at it. So what do you do when you encounter someone with false confidence? First, don't challenge it directly, because that will only make them more defensive. Instead, create space for them to be human. Ask questions that invite vulnerability. Share your own uncertainties. Show them that it's safe to not have all the answers. Sometimes just seeing someone else be real is enough permission for them to drop the act. Second, don't take their defensiveness personally. Remember, it's not about you. It's about their guilt, their shame, their fear of not being enough. So when they snap at you for asking a simple question, understand that you've touched a nerve. Not because you did something wrong, but because you got close to something they're protecting. And that protection is automatic, unconscious, a survival mechanism. But here's what you need to know about guilt. It's one of the most corrosive emotions we can carry, because it tells us we're bad. Not that we did something bad, but that we are bad. And when someone believes that about themselves, they'll do almost anything to prove otherwise, including performing a confidence they don't feel. Because if they can just convince you they're good, maybe they can convince themselves. Now turn this inward. Where are you performing confidence you don't feel? Where are you defending choices you're uncertain about? Where are you pretending to have it together when you're falling apart inside? Because false confidence is something everyone does to some degree. The question is, can you catch yourself doing it? Can you admit when you're not sure? Can you be okay with not having all the answers? Because here's the truth. Real confidence comes from accepting your imperfection, from knowing you're going to make mistakes, from being okay with getting it wrong, from releasing the guilt you carry about not being perfect. And when you do that, when you truly accept yourself as flawed and human, and still worthy, you stop needing to perform. You stop needing to prove. You just are. And that authentic confidence is magnetic because it's real. And real is what people are starving for. Not another performance, but someone brave enough to be imperfect. Someone secure enough to not know. Someone free enough to admit when they're wrong. That's confidence. Everything else is just guilt wearing a disguise. Chapter 10. Exaggeration betrays truth. This one is subtle but powerful. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. People betray themselves through exaggeration. When someone's statements sound too absolute, too extreme, too certain, it's usually because they're trying to convince themselves as much as you. Exaggeration is a tell. It's the ego trying to drown out doubt, and it reveals exactly where someone's insecurity lives. Someone who constantly says, "I don't care what anyone thinks," likely cares deeply. Someone who claims, "I'm always happy," likely isn't. Someone who insists they never get jealous is probably struggling with jealousy regularly. Because if these things were actually true, they wouldn't need to be stated so dramatically. They'd just be. But when someone exaggerates, when they make absolute claims, they're revealing the gap between who they are and who they want to be. Think about how truth actually sounds. It's usually measured, nuanced, qualified. Someone who's genuinely confident doesn't say, "I'm the best." They just are good at what they do. Someone who's truly at peace doesn't announce, "I'm so zen." They just move through life with calm. Someone who doesn't care about others' opinions doesn't proclaim it. They just live freely. Real truth doesn't need volume. It speaks in whispers. But insecurity shouts. Here's how this plays out in everyday life. You're talking to someone and they say, "I literally never get angry." That's an exaggeration, and it's a tell, because everyone gets angry. It's a human emotion. So why are they claiming they don't? Probably because they were taught that anger is bad, that it makes you weak or out of control. So they've repressed it. But the anger is still there. They've just buried it so deep they've convinced themselves it doesn't exist. And the exaggeration is what gives it away. Or someone tells you they're totally fine with being alone. They don't need anyone. They're completely independent. Again, exaggeration. Humans are social creatures. We're wired for connection. So when someone claims they don't need it at all, they're overcompensating. They're protecting against the pain of feeling unwanted, or the fear of being dependent, or the shame of needing others. And the extreme language they use reveals that protection. This is what makes exaggeration such a reliable signal, because it points directly to what someone's trying to hide. The more extreme the claim, the more likely it's covering insecurity. The more absolute the statement, the more doubt exists beneath it. And when you understand this, you stop being fooled by people's grand declarations. You listen past the words to what they're really saying. But exaggeration doesn't just show up in positive claims. It shows up in negative ones too. The person who says everyone always lets me down, that's exaggeration, and it reveals their wound. Probably a deep fear of abandonment, probably a history of feeling unsupported. So they've generalized their pain into an absolute truth. Everyone, always, when reality is more nuanced. Some people let them down, sometimes, but the exaggeration protects them. Because if everyone always lets them down, they don't have to risk trusting anyone. They can stay safe behind their wall, Or think about the person who says nothing ever works out for me. Again, exaggeration. Nothing? Ever? That's not statistically possible. Some things must have worked out, but they're filtering reality through their pain, through their belief that they're doomed. And the exaggeration reinforces that belief. It keeps them stuck in their story, because as long as nothing ever works out, they don't have to try. They don't have to risk failing again. The exaggeration becomes a shield. So when you're reading someone, listen for the extremes. Listen for always and never. Listen for everyone and no one. Listen for the absolute claims that don't allow for nuance. Because those words are red flags. They're telling you where someone's pain lives, where their insecurity hides, where their doubt thrives. And once you hear them, you know exactly what to look for. But here's the key. Don't call out the exaggeration directly, because that will only make them defensive. They'll double down. They'll defend their extreme position even harder. Instead, invite nuance gently. Ask questions that create space for complexity. Has there ever been a time when that wasn't true? What about this specific situation? Questions like that don't attack. They just open a door. And sometimes that's enough for someone to walk through it, to realize their exaggeration, to soften their stance, to get a little closer to truth. Now let's bring this to you. Because you exaggerate too. Everyone does. So pay attention to your own language. When do you use always or never? When do you make absolute claims? When do you speak in extremes? Because those moments are showing you something. They're showing you where you're insecure, where you're protecting, where you're trying to convince yourself of something that isn't quite true. Maybe you say, I always screw everything up. That's not true. But it feels true when you're in pain. So you exaggerate. And that exaggeration reinforces your negative self-image. It keeps you stuck in shame. Or maybe you say, I never get emotional. Again, not true. But claiming it makes you feel strong, makes you feel in control. So you exaggerate. And that exaggeration disconnects you from your own humanity. The practice here is simple but powerful. Start noticing when you exaggerate. And when you catch yourself, soften it. Change I always to I sometimes. Change I never to I rarely. Change everyone to some people. Introduce nuance. Allow for complexity. Allow for the truth. Because the truth is never extreme. It's always somewhere in the middle. And when you start speaking from that middle ground, you stop lying to yourself. You stop reinforcing your wounds. You start seeing reality more clearly. And that clarity is freedom. And when you stop exaggerating yourself, you become far better at spotting it in others. Because you know what it feels like to hide behind absolutes. You know what it sounds like to protect with extremes. And you can hear it immediately when someone else does it. Not to judge them, but to understand them. To see past the performance to the person underneath. To recognize that their exaggeration isn't a lie they're telling you. It's a lie they're telling themselves. And understanding that is the beginning of real compassion. Chapter 11. Control masks inner chaos control. We seek it everywhere, in our jobs, our relationships, our routines. But some people crave it to the point of obsession. They need every detail managed, every variable accounted for, every outcome predicted. And that need, that desperate grasping for control, isn't strength. It's a confession. Those who seek control often fear inner chaos. When the inner world is disordered, the outer world must be managed obsessively. If someone micromanages every detail, if they can't handle change, if they dominate people to feel powerful, it's not because they're strong. It's because something inside them feels wildly out of control. And controlling everything external becomes a way to manage what they can't control internally. Think about it. Have you ever met someone who loses it when plans change? Who gets disproportionately upset over small disruptions? Who needs everything to go exactly as they envisioned? That's not about the plans. It's about what the lack of control triggers in them. Probably anxiety. Probably a fear that if things don't go as expected, they'll fall apart. So they white-knuckle their grip on reality, trying to force it into submission, trying to make it behave. But control is an illusion, and the tighter you grip, the more it slips away. Let me give you a specific example. Someone plans a dinner party. Every detail is mapped out. The menu, the seating, the timing. And when a guest shows up late, they spiral. Not because the food's getting cold, but because their carefully constructed order has been disrupted. And disruption feels like danger, like loss of control, like chaos creeping in. So they react, sometimes with anger, sometimes with anxiety, but always disproportionately, because it was never really about the dinner. It was about maintaining their sense of stability in a world that feels unstable. Or think about the controlling partner, the one who needs to know where you are at all times. Who questions your choices? Who makes all the decisions? On the surface, it might look like jealousy or possessiveness, but underneath, it's fear. Fear that if they're not controlling everything, something bad will happen. Maybe they'll be abandoned. Maybe they'll be betrayed. Maybe they'll lose what matters to them. So they control, not from a place of strength, but from a place of terror. Terror that without control, they're powerless. This is why controlling people are so difficult to be around, because their need for control inevitably controls you. They can't just manage their own life. They need to manage yours too, because your unpredictability threatens their stability. Your freedom reminds them of what they lack. Your spontaneity triggers their anxiety, so they try to contain you, to limit you, to make you predictable, not because they don't love you, but because they're trying to control their own fear by controlling you. So how do you recognize someone who's using control to mask inner chaos? Look for rigidity, for inflexibility, for an inability to adapt when things change. Look for someone who panics when they're not in charge, who gets anxious when outcomes are uncertain, who needs to know everything in advance. That's not someone who's naturally organized. That's someone who's terrified of what happens when they let go. Another sign? They have a hard time relaxing. They can't just be. They always need to be doing, planning, managing, fixing. Because stillness is dangerous. Stillness means facing what's inside. And what's inside feels like chaos. So they stay busy. They stay in control mode. And they convince themselves that their worth is tied to how well they manage everything. But it's exhausting for them and everyone around them. Now here's the compassionate truth. People don't become controlling because they're bad. They become controlling because they're scared. usually because of something that happened in their past. Maybe their childhood was chaotic. Maybe they experienced trauma. Maybe they learned that the world is unpredictable and dangerous. So they developed control as a coping mechanism, as a way to feel safe. And that mechanism worked for a while, but now it's a prison, because the more they control, the more they need to control. It's a cycle that only gets tighter. So what do you do if you're dealing with someone like this? First, understand that you can't fix them. You can't convince them to let go. That's work they have to do themselves. But you can set boundaries. You can say, I understand you need certainty, but I need freedom. You can refuse to participate in their control while still caring about them. And sometimes that boundary is exactly what they need, because it forces them to sit with the discomfort of not being in control. And discomfort is where change begins. But you also need to ask yourself, am I controlling too? Because control isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's subtle. Do you need things done your way? Do you get anxious when someone else takes the lead? Do you struggle to delegate? Do you need to know what's happening at all times? If so, you might be using control to manage your own inner chaos, and recognizing that is the first step to letting go. Because here's the truth. Real peace doesn't come from controlling everything external. It comes from accepting that you can't, from surrendering to uncertainty, from trusting that even when things don't go as planned, you'll be okay. And when you develop that trust, you don't need to control anymore. You can relax, you can adapt. You can flow with life instead of fighting it. And that freedom is worth every moment of discomfort it takes to get there. So the next time you meet someone who needs to control everything, don't fight them. Don't try to convince them to loosen up. Just see them. See the scared person behind the rigid exterior, the one who's holding on so tight because they're terrified of falling apart. And instead of judging them, have compassion, because you know what that fear feels like. You know what it's like to grasp for control when everything inside feels like chaos. And that knowing, that seeing, that's what creates space for healing. Not for you to heal them, but for them to heal themselves when they're finally ready to let go. Chapter 12. Performance hides emptiness. This is one of the most haunting insights you'll ever learn about human behavior, and it applies more today than ever before. The louder the performance, the emptier the core. Look at social media, the endless look at me energy, the perfect poses, the constant updates, the curated identity. What you're witnessing isn't confidence, it's desperation. When someone is constantly performing, it's because they don't believe they'll be seen or loved without it. So they create noise, color, drama, anything to fill the void where their authentic self should be. Think about the people you know who are always on, always entertaining, always projecting happiness, always documenting every moment. What are they running from? Usually emptiness, a sense that without the performance, there's nothing there, no substance, no depth, no worth. So they perform constantly, exhaustively, because the alternative, being still with themselves, is terrifying. Because in the stillness, they might feel the emptiness, and feeling it would confirm what they fear most, that they're hollow. Here's how this manifests. You know someone who can't post a single photo without filtering it, angling it, captioning it perfectly. Who needs every post to get likes? Who checks constantly to see who's watching their story? Who curates their entire life for an audience? What are they really doing? They're building an external identity because they don't have a solid internal one. They're creating a version of themselves that gets approval, because without that approval, they're not sure who they are. Or think about the person who's always performing in real life too. Every conversation is a show. Every interaction feels rehearsed. They're charming, yes. Entertaining, absolutely. But there's something missing. You walk away feeling like you didn't actually connect with them. Like you met a character, not a person. And you're right, because they're not showing you who they are. They're showing you who they think you want them to be. And that performance is exhausting, for them and for you. Now here's what most people don't understand. Performance isn't always obvious. It's not always about being loud or attention-seeking. Sometimes it's subtle. Someone who's always positive, always fine, always putting on a brave face. That's performance too. Because real humans have range. They have good days and bad days. They have complexity. But when someone's always one thing, always consistent in their presentation, it's usually because they're hiding. The performance is protection. Protection from being seen as weak, as needy as human. And that protection comes from a belief that their real self isn't acceptable. So how do you spot when someone's performing rather than being? Look for consistency that doesn't feel natural, for energy that feels forced, for interactions that feel transactional rather than authentic. When someone's being real, there's a relaxation to them, an ease, even when they're upset or struggling. But when someone's performing, there's tension, there's effort. There's a sense that they're managing their presentation rather than just existing. Another sign? They have a hard time with silence, with downtime, with moments that aren't curated, because those moments require them to just be, and being requires a self. If there's emptiness where the self should be, those moments are unbearable, so they fill them with noise, with activity, with performance, anything to avoid the void. Let me tell you why this is so sad. Because underneath every performance is a person who believes they're not enough as they are, who learned somewhere along the way that their authentic self wasn't acceptable. So they created a version that would be. And over time, that version became so convincing that even they started to believe it, until they forgot who they really were, and now they're trapped, performing a role they can no longer escape, because the performance has become their identity, and without it, they fear they're nothing. So what do you do when you encounter someone who's always performing? You create space for them to be real. You don't feed the performance. You don't applaud the show. You ask real questions. You share real things. You show them through your own authenticity that it's safe to drop the act. Because sometimes all someone needs is permission. Permission to be imperfect, to be uncertain, to be struggling. And when you give that permission through your own example, you're offering them a lifeline out of their emptiness. But you also need to recognize this. Performance isn't just something others do. You do it too. We all do. So ask yourself, where am I performing? Where am I curating rather than being? Where am I hiding behind a version of myself that's more acceptable? Because until you face your own performance, you can't truly see it in others. And until you drop your own act, you can't create real connection with anyone, because real recognizes real, and performance only recognizes performance. Here's what I've learned. The person who truly knows themselves doesn't need to perform. They don't need to be watched. They're already whole. They can sit in a room alone and feel complete. They can have a bad day without pretending it's good. They can be imperfect without shame. And that groundedness, that authenticity, that's magnetic. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. And people are starving for real. They're exhausted by performance. They want connection. They want truth. They want someone who isn't afraid to be human. So stop performing. Stop curating. Stop hiding behind the version of yourself you think people want. Just be. Be messy. Be uncertain. Be real. And watch what happens. Watch how the right people move closer. How the wrong people fall away. How your life becomes simpler but fuller. How your relationships become fewer but deeper. Because when you stop performing, you stop attracting an audience. You start attracting connection. And connection is what we're all really looking for. Not applause, not validation, but someone who sees us, really sees us, and chooses to stay anyway. That's the antidote to emptiness. Not performance, but presence. Not curation, but authenticity. Not the show, but the soul underneath. Part 3. The Soul, Chapter 13. People speak from pain, not logic. You might think that people are rational, that they argue based on facts, that they make decisions based on reason. But there's a deeper truth that changes how you understand every conversation you'll ever have. Underneath every logical argument is an emotional wound. People don't speak from logic. They speak from pain. And when you understand this, suddenly every debate, every disagreement, every strong opinion makes sense. Because it was never about the argument. It was always about the wound. A person might say, I don't believe in love. It's just a fantasy. They'll give you evolutionary biology, psychology, statistics on divorce rates, and it all sounds logical. But listen closer. What they're really saying is, I was hurt. I trusted someone, and they destroyed me. And I never want to feel that pain again. So I've decided love isn't real. Because if it's not real, I don't have to mourn what I lost. I don't have to grieve what I'll never have again. The logic is just a shield. The wound is what's actually speaking. Or think about the person who has strong political beliefs. They argue their position passionately. They cite facts and data. They debate endlessly. But underneath those facts is usually something personal. Maybe they grew up poor, and their beliefs reflect that pain. Maybe they experienced discrimination, and their views are shaped by that trauma. Maybe they lost someone to violence, and their opinions are born from grief. The positions they hold aren't just intellectual. They're emotional. They're survival. They're attempts to make sense of their pain by creating a worldview that explains it. This is what most people miss in conversations. They argue with the logic. They try to disprove the facts. They think if they present better information, the other person will change their mind. But that's not how it works. Because the other person wasn't convinced by logic in the first place. They were convinced by pain, and pain doesn't respond to facts. It responds to healing. So when someone has a strong opinion about something, don't just ask what they think. Ask why they think it. Ask what happened that made them believe this. Ask what they're protecting by holding this view. Because every worldview is a protection, a way of making sense of suffering, a way of creating order from chaos. And when you understand what someone's protecting, you finally understand what they're really saying. Let me give you a personal example. Someone I knew was adamantly against therapy. They thought it was self-indulgent, a waste of money, something weak people did. And they'd argue this position logically. But when I finally asked why they felt so strongly about it, the truth came out. Their mother had been in therapy for years, and it never seemed to help. She'd still been miserable, still been absent, and they'd felt abandoned. So therapy, in their mind, became the thing that took their mother away. And their strong opinion wasn't logical. It was pain. Pain that if they acknowledged the value of therapy, they'd have to face that their mother chose it over them. And that was too painful to admit. This is why arguing rarely changes minds. Because you're arguing against logic that's really just pain wearing a disguise. And pain doesn't surrender to facts. It only surrenders to compassion, to being seen. To someone saying, I understand why you believe this. I understand what it's protecting you from. And that understanding, that acknowledgement of the pain, that's what creates space for change. Not argument, understanding. So how do you have a real conversation with someone when you know they're speaking from pain? You don't challenge their position directly. You get curious about their story. You ask where this belief came from, what experiences shaped it, what it helps them avoid feeling. And when they share that story, you listen. Really listen, not to find flaws, not to prepare your counter-argument, but to understand their wound. Because once you understand the wound, you can speak to it, not to fix it, but to acknowledge it. And that acknowledgement is often enough to soften a defensive position. But here's the hard part. This applies to you too. Your beliefs aren't as rational as you think they are. Your opinions aren't just based on facts. They're based on your history, your pain, your fears, your need to make sense of what happened to you. So when you find yourself arguing passionately about something, pause. Ask yourself, what wound is this protecting? What pain am I trying to avoid by holding this view? What would I have to feel if I admitted I might be wrong? Because here's the truth. The beliefs you defend most strongly are usually the ones protecting your deepest wounds. And until you're willing to face those wounds, you'll keep defending the beliefs. Not because they're true, but because they're necessary. They're the story you tell yourself to avoid feeling what you're not ready to feel. And that's okay. We all do it. The question is, can you become aware of it? Can you catch yourself speaking from pain instead of logic? Can you own it when you do? Because when you can admit, I believe this because of what happened to me, something shifts. You stop being so certain. You start being more curious. You become open to other perspectives, not because you've been proven wrong, but because you've stopped needing to be right. And that openness changes everything. It changes how you communicate, how you relate, how you learn, because you're no longer defending your pain. You're simply sharing your experience. And experience can be held alongside other experiences. It doesn't have to compete. It doesn't have to win. It can just exist. So the next time someone argues with you, remember this. They're not really arguing with you. They're arguing with their past. They're defending against a pain they haven't fully processed. And if you can see that, if you can respond to the pain instead of the argument, you might actually connect. You might actually reach them, not by proving them wrong, but by showing them they've been seen. And being seen, truly seen, is often the first step toward healing, which is what everyone's really looking for. Not to be right, but to be understood. Not to win, but to be heard. And when you give someone that gift, you're not just ending an argument. You're offering them a chance to put down the weapon they've been carrying, the weapon of their unhealed pain. And that's far more powerful than any logical debate could ever be. Chapter 14. Reactions to weakness reveal true power. Want to truly see someone's character? Don't watch how they treat powerful people. Watch how they treat someone who can't fight back. Real strength isn't proven through domination. It's revealed through restraint, through how someone responds when they have all the power and the other person has none. Because that's when you see who they really are, not who they pretend to be when it serves them. If someone mocks vulnerability, they're afraid of their own. If someone punishes mistakes harshly, they likely weren't allowed to make any themselves. If someone always wins but leaves others bleeding, they're still at war with themselves. Because people who have won their inner war don't need to crush others. They don't need to prove their strength. They simply are strong, and strength that's real is gentle. It's measured. It knows when to fight and when to hold space. Think about it. You're in a situation where someone makes a mistake. Maybe they spill something. Maybe they say the wrong thing. Maybe they show uncertainty or fear. How do the people around them respond? Some will mock. Some will punish. Some will seize the opportunity to feel superior. But watch the one who doesn't, the one who helps clean up without making it a big deal, the one who offers reassurance instead of judgment, the one who makes space for imperfection without calling attention to it. That person has real power, not the kind that dominates, the kind that uplifts. Or think about how someone treats service workers, the waiter, the janitor, the person at the checkout counter. Do they make eye contact? Say thank you? Treat them with basic respect? Or do they ignore them? Snap at them? Act like they're invisible? Because how someone treats people they perceive as beneath them tells you everything about their character. If they're only kind to people who can do something for them, that's not kindness. That's strategy. But if they're kind to everyone, regardless of status, that's integrity. That's someone who understands that every human deserves dignity. And that understanding only comes from real strength. Now, let's talk about vulnerability specifically, because this is where people reveal themselves most clearly. When someone shares something difficult, when they admit they're struggling, when they show weakness, how do you respond? Do you listen with compassion, or do you judge them? Do you offer support, or do you use their vulnerability against them later? Because people who are secure can hold space for others' pain. They're not threatened by it. They don't need to fix it or minimize it. They can just be present with it. But people who are insecure, vulnerability terrifies them because it reminds them of their own pain, their own weakness, their own fear. So they attack it. They mock it. They dismiss it, not because the vulnerable person did anything wrong, but because witnessing vulnerability triggers the observer's unresolved wounds, and that's uncomfortable, so they make it stop by shutting it down, by shaming it, by making vulnerability seem like a character flaw instead of a human experience. Let me give you an example. Someone shares that they're struggling with anxiety. One person responds with, "That's tough. How can I support you?" Another responds with, "Just stop worrying so much." One person is holding space, the other is dismissing. And that dismissal tells you everything. It tells you they can't hold space for their own anxiety, so they can't hold space for anyone else's. They've learned to suppress it, to power through it, to pretend it doesn't exist. And seeing someone else acknowledge it threatens that entire defense system. So here's the test. Watch how someone treats weakness, not weakness in themselves. They might never show that, but weakness in others. Do they have compassion or contempt? Do they help or do they harm? Do they protect or do they exploit? Because that response tells you who they are at their core, and it tells you whether they've done their inner work or not. Someone who's done their inner work can witness pain without needing to fix it. They can see mistakes without needing to punish them. They can hold space for imperfection without feeling threatened, because they've accepted their own pain, their own mistakes, their own imperfection. And that acceptance gives them the capacity to extend it to others. But someone who hasn't done that work, they can't. They're too busy managing their own shame to have room for anyone else's. Now turn this inward. How do you respond to weakness? Be honest. When someone shows you their vulnerable side, do you move closer or pull away? When someone makes a mistake, do you show grace or judgment? When someone needs help, do you offer it freely or resent being asked? Because your response reveals your relationship with your own weakness. If you can't be kind to others in their struggle, it's because you can't be kind to yourself in yours. And here's the practice. Start treating others' weakness the way you wish someone had treated yours. When you were struggling, when you made mistakes, when you needed help, remember what it felt like to be judged, to be shamed, to be abandoned in your pain, and then choose differently. Choose compassion, choose presence, choose to be the person you needed when you were suffering, because that's how you heal, not just for them, but for you. Every time you show kindness to someone else's weakness, you're showing kindness to your own. Every time you hold space for someone else's pain, you're learning to hold space for your own. And that practice, repeated over and over, is what transforms you from someone who's strong because they suppress to someone who's strong because they've integrated. Real power isn't about never being weak. It's about being comfortable enough with your own weakness that you can witness it in others without flinching. That's strength. That's maturity. That's what separates people who have truly grown from people who are still pretending. And when you meet someone with that kind of power, hold on to them, because they're rare. They're the ones who will stand with you in your worst moments, not because they have to, but because they're secure enough to do so. And that security is the greatest gift anyone can offer. Not perfection, but presence. Not strength that dominates, but strength that serves. Chapter 15. Attention seeking hides fear of invisibility. Ever met someone who always needs to be seen? Every room they enter, every story they tell, every outfit they wear screams, "Notice me." At first glance, it looks like confidence, like someone who's comfortable being the center of attention. But look closer. What you're witnessing isn't confidence. It's desperation. When someone fears being forgotten, they chase attention, not because they love it, but because they can't bear the alternative. Invisibility. Think about what invisibility means. It means not mattering, not being remembered, not leaving a mark. For some people, that's their deepest fear, deeper than death, because at least death is an event. Someone notices, someone grieves. But invisibility, that's being forgotten while you're still alive. That's living and leaving no trace. And for people who carry this fear, attention becomes survival. It's proof they exist, proof they matter, proof they're not being erased. So they create noise. They dominate spaces. They make sure they're the most interesting person in the room. They overshare. They overdress. They perform constantly, not because they're narcissists, but because they're terrified. Terrified that if they're quiet, no one will notice they're gone. And that fear drives everything, every post, every story, every dramatic moment. It's all a scream into the void saying, "I'm here. Please see me. Please don't forget me." Now here's what makes this so tragic. The more someone chases attention, the less connection they actually get. Because real connection doesn't come from being seen. It comes from being known. And you can't be known if you're always performing. If you're always on, if you're always managing your image, because what people are seeing isn't you. It's the character you're playing, the version you think will keep them interested. And that version gets attention, but it doesn't get love. And attention without love is empty. It's filling a void that just gets bigger the more you try to fill it. So how do you spot someone whose attention-seeking is rooted in fear rather than genuine confidence? Look at what happens when they don't get attention. Do they spiral? Do they get desperate? Do they escalate? That's fear. Someone who genuinely enjoys being the center of attention can also step back. They can let someone else shine. They can be okay in the background, but someone who's chasing attention to avoid invisibility can't. Every moment they're not being seen feels like death, so they'll do anything to stay visible, even if it means being destructive. Even if it means pushing people away, because negative attention is still attention. And attention, any attention, is better than being forgotten. Here's a specific example. You're at a gathering, one person is telling a story, everyone's listening. Then someone else jumps in, not to add to the story, but to redirect attention to themselves. They interrupt. They one-up. They make it about them. Why? Because they couldn't handle not being the focus. The fear kicked in. The fear that if they weren't the center, they'd disappear. So they grabbed it back, aggressively, unconsciously, not because they're selfish, but because they're scared. Or think about social media. Someone posts constantly, multiple times a day, every meal, every thought, every moment. And they're checking constantly who liked it, who commented, who saw their story. That's not someone documenting their life. That's someone proving their existence. They need the notifications, the views, the engagement, because without it, they feel invisible. and invisible feels like non-existence. Now here's the compassionate truth. People don't become like this because they're vain. They become like this because they were invisible once. Maybe as a child, maybe in a relationship, maybe in a family where they were overlooked, and that invisibility was so painful that they decided never to feel it again. So they learned to be loud, to be bright, to be impossible to ignore. And that strategy worked for a while. But now it's a prison, because they can't ever stop, they can't ever rest. They can't ever just be, because being means risking invisibility again. And that's too terrifying. So what do you do if you're dealing with someone like this? You give them what they actually need. Not attention, but presence. You see them, really see them. Not the performance, but the person underneath. You ask them real questions. You listened deeply. You show them they matter not because of what they do, but because of who they are. And that kind of seeing, that kind of presence, it's healing. Because it tells them they don't have to perform to be valued. They don't have to chase to be remembered. They're enough just existing. But you also need to look at yourself, because we all chase attention sometimes. Maybe not as obviously, but in subtle ways. Do you need people to acknowledge your achievements? Do you feel unsettled when you're not being talked about? Do you find yourself creating drama just to feel relevant? If so, you might be running from your own fear of invisibility, and recognizing that is the first step to healing it. Because here's the truth. You don't need to be seen by everyone to matter. You just need to be seen by the right people. And the right people are the ones who see you when you're quiet. When you're not performing, when you're just being. Those are the people who make you feel real. Not the audience, not the followers, not the people who only notice you when you're loud, but the ones who notice you when you're still. And when you find those people, you realize you don't need to chase anymore. You can just be, and being is enough, more than enough. It's everything. Chapter 16. Attack reveals envy. One of the hardest truths to admit is this. People don't always attack because they hate. They often attack because they admire but feel they can never be. Criticism is easier than admiration. So the person who tears down someone successful, who mocks someone confident, who gossips about someone free, isn't just mean. They're in pain. Because to see someone embody a part of you that you've abandoned is to be reminded of what you've lost. And that reminder hurts. So instead of celebrating the other, we destroy them. Think about it. When someone achieves something you wanted but never pursued, how do you feel? If you're honest, probably some envy, some resentment. Some part of you thinks, why them and not me? And that feeling is uncomfortable. So uncomfortable that most people won't admit it. Instead, they find reasons to diminish the achievement. They say they got lucky. They say they sold out. They say they probably aren't even happy. And all of that is projection. It's the ego protecting itself from having to face its own disappointment, its own fear, its own sense of having settled. Here's a specific example. Someone leaves their corporate job to pursue art, and they're successful. They're happy. They're living the life they dreamed of. Now watch the reactions. Some people will be genuinely happy for them, but others will criticize. They'll say it's irresponsible. They'll say it won't last. They'll find every flaw in the decision. Why? Because seeing someone live freely reminds them of their own cage, and that reminder is painful. So they attack the freedom, they make it wrong, because if it's wrong, they don't have to face that they chose safety over passion, that they gave up on their own dreams, that they're living a life they don't actually want. This is what makes envy so destructive. It's not just about wanting what someone else has. It's about being reminded of what you've lost in yourself. And that loss feels like grief, but grief is vulnerable. So instead of grieving, we attack. We tear down the person who's triggering our pain. And we convince ourselves we're being rational, objective, just pointing out the truth. But really, we're just protecting our ego from having to admit we're jealous. Now here's where it gets more complex. Envy isn't always about material things. Sometimes it's about qualities, about ways of being. Someone is unapologetically themselves. They set boundaries. They speak their truth. They live authentically. And that triggers people. Why? Because most people are performing. Most people are compromising. Most people are bending themselves to fit. And seeing someone who isn't doing that is threatening. It says you don't have to live this way. You could choose differently, and that possibility is terrifying. Because choosing differently would mean admitting you've been choosing wrong. And that's too painful. So instead of being inspired, people attack. They call the authentic person selfish, difficult, too much. They make authenticity seem like a character flaw. Because if authenticity is wrong, they don't have to question their own compliance. They don't have to face their own self-betrayal. They can stay comfortable in their compromise. And attacking the authentic person lets them stay there. Let me tell you about a time I experienced this. I set a boundary with someone, a clear, respectful boundary, and their response was to call me selfish, to say I only cared about myself, to paint me as the bad guy. But what they were really saying was, I wish I could do that. I wish I could say no. I wish I could prioritize myself, but I can't, so I'm going to make you wrong for doing what I'm too scared to do. That's envy, disguised as moral judgment. And once I saw it that way, I stopped being hurt by it, because I realized their attack had nothing to do with me. It was about them, about what they envied but couldn't access in themselves. So how do you spot envy in others? Listen to their criticism. Is it about facts, or is it personal? Is it constructive, or is it mean? Is it coming from a place of concern, or from a place of resentment? Because constructive criticism says here's how this could be better. Envy-driven criticism says this shouldn't exist at all. One wants to improve. The other wants to destroy. And destruction is always about threat, about something in the other person triggering something unhealed in the critic. Another sign? The criticism is disproportionate. Small achievements get torn apart. Minor choices get overanalyzed. Success gets minimized or attributed to luck. All of that is envy. Because if the achievement were truly insignificant, why spend so much energy talking about it? The attention itself reveals the importance, and that importance is what's threatening, because it highlights what the critic hasn't done, what they've been too afraid to pursue, what they've given up on. Now here's the hard part. You envy too. Everyone does. So instead of denying it, own it. When you feel that pang of resentment toward someone's success, don't push it down. Don't rationalize it away. Just acknowledge it. Say to yourself, I'm feeling envious. And then ask the deeper question. What is this person showing me that I want for myself? What have I abandoned that they're still pursuing? What part of me am I being reminded of? Because envy is a compass. It points you toward your own unlived life, toward the dreams you've buried, toward the parts of yourself you've disowned. And when you see it that way, envy stops being something to be ashamed of. It becomes information. It becomes an invitation to reclaim what you've lost, to pursue what you've been afraid to become who you stopped letting yourself be. And that's powerful, because instead of tearing others down, you start building yourself up. Instead of attacking what they have, you start creating what you want. Instead of being controlled by envy, you use it as fuel to close the gap between who you are and who you could be. So the next time you feel envy rise up, don't judge yourself for it. Just notice it, name it, and then ask what it's trying to tell you. Because every person you envy is showing you a possibility, a version of life you didn't think was available to you. And instead of resenting them for living it, you could thank them. Thank them for reminding you that it's possible. And then go create your own version, not by copying them, but by reconnecting with the parts of yourself that want to be expressed, the parts you've been ignoring, the parts that are calling you back home. That's the antidote to envy, not pretending you don't feel it, but feeling it and using it as a map. A map back to your own desires, your own dreams, your own unlived potential. And when you do that, when you reclaim what you've envied in others for yourself, something beautiful happens. You stop attacking. You start celebrating. Because you're no longer threatened by others' success. You're inspired by it. And that shift from threat to inspiration is the shift from envy to empowerment. And that's where real freedom lives. Chapter 17. Adults act out childhood wounds. You've heard it said that people don't change. But the truth is more nuanced. People don't change because they're not actually living. They're repeating. They're repeating the roles they were forced to play, the fears they were taught to carry, the dynamics they never escaped. And until someone becomes conscious of those patterns, they'll keep reenacting them over and over, in every relationship, in every job, in every choice. Because behavior isn't random, it's biographical. Think about it. A person who was never heard as a child becomes someone who never listens as an adult. Not because they're selfish, but because they never learned what listening looks like. They never experienced it themselves, so they can't offer it. A person who is punished for expressing emotions becomes cold, logical, detached. Not because they don't feel, but because feeling was dangerous, so they shut it down. And that shutdown became their personality. They think it's who they are, but it's actually who they had to be to survive. Or consider the person who had to earn love, who was only valued for their achievements, only praised when they succeeded. What do they become as adults? Workaholics, perfectionists, people who can never rest because their worth is tied to their output. They think they're just ambitious, but really they're still trying to earn love, still performing for approval, still terrified that if they stop achieving, they'll stop being valued. because that's what childhood taught them, and they never unlearned it. Here's another one. Someone who grew up in chaos, unpredictable parents, unstable home, constant crisis. What do they do as adults? They recreate it, not consciously, but they're drawn to chaotic relationships, dramatic situations, unstable environments. Why? Because chaos feels like home. Calm feels foreign. Peaceful feels unsafe. So they unconsciously seek what's familiar, even when it hurts, because familiar is safer than unknown. Even when familiar is toxic. This is what people miss when they judge someone's choices. They think, why do they keep choosing the same type of person? Why do they keep ending up in the same situation? Why don't they just change? But they don't understand. It's not a choice. It's a pattern programmed in childhood. And until someone becomes aware of it, they can't break it. They'll just keep repeating, because the unconscious mind doesn't care about happiness. It cares about familiarity, and it will recreate whatever's familiar, even if it's painful, because pain that's known feels safer than joy that's unknown. So when you're reading someone, don't just look at who they are now. Ask who they had to be then. What role did they play in their family? Were they the caretaker, the scapegoat, the golden child, the invisible one? Because that role shaped everything. Their beliefs about themselves, their expectations of relationships, their tolerance for pain, their capacity for joy. All of it traces back to childhood, always. Let me give you a specific example. Someone is in a relationship where they're constantly giving, constantly accommodating, constantly putting the other person's needs first, and they're exhausted, resentful, unhappy, but they can't leave, they can't even speak up. Why? Probably because in childhood they had to be the caretaker. Maybe they had a parent who was sick, or emotionally unavailable, or overwhelmed, and this person learned that their job was to make things easier, to not be a burden, to prioritize everyone else, and that role didn't end when childhood did. It just transferred from parent to partner, from family to friend, and now they're trapped, still playing the same role, still sacrificing themselves, still unable to ask for what they need, because they never learned they were allowed to. Or think about someone who sabotages every good thing that comes their way. They get a great opportunity and they blow it. They find a healthy relationship and they destroy it. They start to succeed and they self-destruct. Why? Probably because in childhood, good things didn't last. Maybe every time things got better, something bad happened. So they learned that happiness is temporary, that the other shoe will always drop. And now, as adults, they drop it themselves. They sabotage preemptively, because at least that way they're in control. At least that way they're not caught off guard when it all falls apart. They make it fall apart on purpose, because that feels safer than waiting for it to happen on its own. This is heartbreaking, but it's also common. Almost everyone is acting out some version of their childhood wound. The question is, how consciously? Because consciousness is what breaks the pattern. When you become aware that you're repeating something, you can choose differently. But if you're unconscious, you'll just keep looping, wondering why your life feels the same, even though the circumstances change. Not realizing that you're the constant. You're the one bringing the pattern with you everywhere you go. So how do you spot someone's childhood wound in their adult behavior? Look for repetition. Look for patterns that don't make logical sense. Why does someone keep attracting emotionally unavailable partners? Why does someone always end up in codependent friendships? Why does someone repeatedly choose jobs where they're undervalued? These aren't coincidences. These are reenactments. The unconscious mind trying to resolve something from the past by recreating it in the present, hoping this time will be different. But it never is, because the wound is internal, not external. And until it's healed internally, the external will keep reflecting it back. Now let's bring this to you. What patterns do you repeat? What dynamics keep showing up in your life? What pain feels strangely familiar? Because that's your wound. That's the part of your childhood that's still running the show. And until you face it, you'll keep living it. You'll keep choosing the same types of people, the same types of situations, the same types of pain, not because you're broken, but because you're trying to heal. You're trying to go back and fix what went wrong, but you can't fix the past by repeating it. You can only heal it by becoming conscious of it, by seeing the pattern, by choosing differently, by parenting the wounded child inside you in the way you needed to be parented then. That's the work, and it's hard work. It requires honesty, vulnerability, willingness to feel what you've been avoiding. But it's the only way to break free. The only way to stop repeating. The only way to become an adult who's actually living instead of just reenacting childhood. And when you do that work, when you heal those wounds, you stop being controlled by your past. You stop being a victim of your programming. You become the author of your own story. And that's freedom, not the absence of pain, but the ability to feel it, heal it, and move forward anyway. That's what growing up actually means. Not aging, but awakening to who you were, to who you became, to who you can still choose to be. Chapter 18. Patterns are confessions. This is the final truth. And it changes everything. People don't always know how to express what hurts, but they will show you again and again. Through patterns, through behaviors that repeat, through choices that don't seem to make sense until you see the pattern. And when you learn to read patterns, you're no longer confused by people, because their patterns are confessions, confessions of what they fear, what they're protecting, what they've never healed. A person who ghosts when things get close, that's a pattern, and it's a confession. It's saying, I'm afraid of intimacy. I'm afraid if you get too close, you'll see the parts of me I don't want you to see. So I leave before you can reject me. A person who overworks to avoid stillness. That's a pattern, and it's a confession. It's saying if I stop moving, I'll have to feel something I've been running from. So I stay busy. I stay distracted. I stay safe from my own emotions. A person who flirts with everyone but connects with no one. That's a pattern, and it's a confession. It's saying I want connection, but I'm terrified of it. So I keep it surface. I keep it light. I never let anyone in far enough to hurt me. These aren't random behaviors. They're strategies. Strategies for managing pain, for avoiding vulnerability, for protecting wounds that never fully healed. And here's what makes patterns so powerful. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. You stop being surprised when someone does the same thing again. You stop expecting different results. You just see the pattern, and you understand. You understand that this is how they protect themselves. This is how they survive, and that understanding gives you a choice. You can stay and accept the pattern, or you can leave and honor your needs. But you stop being confused. You stop taking it personally. Because you see, it's not about you. It's about them, about their history, about their wounds, about their fear. Let me give you a specific example. You're dating someone. Every time you try to have a serious conversation, they make a joke. They deflect. They change the subject. At first, you might think they're just light-hearted, but it keeps happening every time. That's a pattern, and it's telling you something. It's saying serious conversations feel dangerous to me. Maybe in their family, serious conversations always led to conflict, or criticism, or punishment. So they learned to avoid them, to keep things light, to never go deep. And now, as an adult, that's still their strategy. They're not trying to hurt you by avoiding depth. They're trying to protect themselves from what depth triggers in them. Or think about someone who always plays the victim, always has a crisis, always needs rescuing. And every time you help, it's never enough. Nothing changes. The crisis just shifts. That's a pattern. And it's a confession. It's saying, I don't know how to get attention without suffering. I don't know how to be valued unless I'm needed. So I stay in crisis. I stay in chaos, because that's when people care. That's when I matter. And if I got healthy, I'm terrified I'd become invisible. Now here's the key. Patterns don't exist in isolation. They build systems. A person who avoids conflict creates a relationship where resentment builds. A person who needs control creates a dynamic where others feel powerless. A person who never asks for help creates a life of isolation, and these systems reinforce the pattern. The pattern creates the system. The system reinforces the pattern, and the person gets stuck, believing that this is just how life is, not realizing they're creating it, over and over, through their unconscious repetition. So how do you break a pattern? First, you have to see it. You have to become conscious of what you're doing, and that's hard, because patterns feel like personality. They feel like who you are, but they're not. They're just strategies you developed to cope with pain. And strategies can be changed once you see them. But you can't change what you're not aware of. Second, you have to understand what the pattern is protecting you from. What would you have to feel if you stopped the pattern? What would you have to face? What would you lose? Because every pattern serves a purpose. It's keeping you safe from something. And until you know what that something is, you won't be able to let go of the pattern. You'll just keep repeating it. Because the fear of facing what's underneath is stronger than the pain of staying stuck. And third, you have to choose differently, consciously, intentionally, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when every instinct is screaming at you to go back to the familiar. You have to choose the new behavior, the healthy behavior, the one that breaks the pattern, and you have to do it again and again until the new behavior becomes the new pattern. And that takes time. It takes courage. It takes willingness to sit with the discomfort of change, but it's the only way. So as you move through the world, start noticing patterns in others, in yourself. Watch what repeats, what shows up again and again despite changing circumstances. Because those repetitions are trying to tell you something. They're confessions of unhealed wounds, of unmet needs, of unconscious fears. And when you can see them with compassion instead of judgment, everything changes. You stop being frustrated with people who keep making the same mistakes. You understand they're trapped in a pattern they can't yet see. You stop being confused by your own choices. You recognize the pattern you've been repeating, and you start to heal. Not by forcing change, but by becoming aware, by shining light on what's been operating in the dark, by seeing the pattern for what it is, a survival strategy, one that worked once, but that's now keeping you stuck. And here's the beautiful truth. When you break your own patterns, you stop being controlled by them. You stop repeating your past. You stop living unconsciously. You become free. Free to choose. Free to grow. Free to create a life that's not just a reflection of your wounds, but an expression of your potential. And that freedom, that's what we're all really searching for. Not perfection. Not happiness, but freedom. Freedom from the patterns that keep us small, from the wounds that keep us stuck, from the unconscious repetition that keeps us trapped. So start paying attention. Start seeing the patterns in yourself and others, in the world around you, because patterns are everywhere. And when you learn to read them, you gain a superpower, the power to see what's really happening beneath the surface, the power to understand why people do what they do, the power to stop taking things personally, and the power to finally break free from the patterns that have been running your life. That's the gift of this final truth. Not just reading others, but reading yourself, and in that reading, finding your freedom. Conclusion. You're not just reading people, you're remembering yourself. Now take a moment and reflect. Every truth we covered wasn't just about other people. It was about you. Your own patterns, your own fears, your own childhood scripts. Because the more clearly you see others, the more clearly you see yourself. This isn't the end of the journey. It's the beginning of a new way of seeing. Understanding human nature isn't about gaining power over others. It's about gaining clarity. Clarity about why people do what they do, why you do what you do, and in that clarity, finding compassion. Because when you truly see someone, when you understand the fear and pain driving their behavior, it becomes almost impossible to hate them. You might still set boundaries. You might still walk away. But you do it with understanding rather than judgment. And here's what changes when you live with this awareness. You stop being shocked by human behavior. You stop feeling betrayed when people act in ways that seem out of character, because you realize there is no out of character. There's only the mask and what's beneath it. And when you can see beneath the mask, you're no longer confused. You're no longer hurt. You're just aware. But awareness comes with responsibility, because once you see clearly, you can't unsee. Once you understand someone's wound, you can't pretend you don't. And that means you have to make choices, conscious choices, about who you let into your life, about how you respond to people, about what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not. Because seeing people clearly doesn't mean accepting everything they do. It means understanding why they do it, and then deciding how you want to show up in response. So as you move forward, remember this. Every person is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Every behavior is rooted in something deeper. Every mask is protecting a wound. And when you can see that, when you can hold that awareness without judgment, you become a force for healing. Not by fixing people, but by seeing them, really seeing them, and in that seeing offering them a mirror that reflects not just their mask, but their humanity. This is the gift of learning to read people, not control, not manipulation, but connection. Real connection, the kind that sees beneath the surface, the kind that holds space for imperfection, the kind that says, I see your fear, your pain, your wound, and I'm here anyway, not to fix you, but to witness you. Because being witnessed, being truly seen, that's what heals. That's what transforms. That's what reminds people they're not alone in their struggle. And as you offer that gift to others, you're also offering it to yourself. Because every time you see someone else's humanity, you're reclaiming your own. Every time you choose compassion over judgment, you're healing your relationship with yourself. Every time you recognize a pattern in someone else, you're becoming conscious of your own. This work isn't just about reading people. It's about becoming whole. So welcome to the truth behind the mask. Welcome to the beginning of real sight. Welcome to the understanding that you are not separate from anyone you meet, that we're all just mirrors, reflecting each other's light and darkness. And the moment you see that, the moment you embrace it, is the moment you stop being a victim of your patterns and become the author of your transformation. The universe is always communicating. Every person is a teacher. Every interaction is a lesson. And when you learn to read the language, when you learn to see what's really being said beneath the words, you gain access to a wisdom that changes everything. Not just how you see others, but how you see yourself. And in that seeing, you remember who you've always been. Not the mask, but the soul underneath, the one that's been waiting patiently for you to finally come home.